Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this sixth in the series of University of Buckingham conversations with great minds. And tonight we have Christina Lamb, the very celebrated, much honoured, very distinguished foreign correspondent, journalist, and author, talking in particular about her latest book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, described by the military historian Anthony Beevor as the finest book he'd ever read, which is an accolade shared by many people. And we're going to begin, Christina, with your early years. And what was it that forged this extraordinary force of nature that you became? And we're just going to pause there for a moment while just one or two extra people join. Can I say in that pause that Christina has there's slight, as you'll be able to see from the quality of the screen, we're hoping that her internet connection is going to improve. Apparently on Friday evening, it's a dodgy time, but we're going to hope for the very best. And just while we're waiting, Christina, last night with William Boyd, the novelist, we were saying that one of the joys of interviewing writers virtually rather than face to face is that you can see their houses and their rooms. And just describe to us, Christina, what room are we looking at? What is the background here? Just a pause there, if you can hear me. And hoping that Christina will be able to be on in just a second.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear?
Which is, now I'm worried about what I might have behind me. Yeah, this is my study, and now I'm worried about what I might have behind me.
I can assure you it's very blurred. Is this the room?
I have actually a very odd thing, which is a box of Osama bin Laden's sweets.
And well, we'll come on to that. We mustn't forget how we got onto Osama bin Laden's sweets. That's in store for later. But can you give us any insight about how you forged your own career? What were those early influences at non-such girls' grammar school near Sutton, and then on to Oxford for PPE? When did you start sensing the allure in your nostrils of abroad and war zones and writing? I mean, why didn't you just become an accountant with Arthur Anderson? I mean, there was much the sensible thing to have done, or become a banker.
I think that's what my parents would have liked me to be. My father wanted me to marry a high school for girls. Issues with. I wasn't the best behaved girl in the school, I suppose you could say. I was very, at that time, I was very much always wanted to write. I used to read all the time, and I loved writing. And I also used to like drama a lot, and I had set up a drama group at school, which we had a very strict headmistress. And she didn't really like my drama group because she thought it was very irreverent. And we used to do plays in morning assembly, which were loosely based on biblical themes, because that was the only way we were allowed to do them. But we mostly based them on Monty Python sketches, which was very popular at the time. And the headmistress did not like that at all. So the drama group actually got banned, which made me feel very aggrieved. And I actually then ended up kidnapping, which then became a sort of myth in the school of who had taken this chair, which I didn't admit until long afterwards, because the chair then disappeared from where I'd hidden it, and so I couldn't give it back.
So
and it became a very serious.
A rebellious streak and spirit of adventure from very early on. And at Oxford, is that where you decided that you were going to go into foreign correspondence and writing?
So, to be completely honest, I didn't know much about journalism before I went to Oxford. My parents used to read the Daily Mail, and I had never met a journalist. And I had this dream really of writing novels. And then one day at Oxford, a friend of mine was going to a cheese and wine party and invited me along. And of course, being a student, the idea of free cheese and wine was very appealing. And this party turned out to be for the university newspaper, Chartwell. And people spoke at it, different section editors, and it sounded absolutely fascinating to me. So I joined and ended up editing that paper in the end. So that's what introduced me to journalism. But to be honest, I still didn't really think about being a journalist, live in a garret somewhere and write about them.
I'm just going to suggest here, Christina, that perhaps could you try turning off the camera just to see if that it might, and then we'll put it on again in a moment. We try that for a moment and see what happens.
Okay.
And then in 1988, a Young Journalist of the Year award for your work in Afghanistan. What happened there? Tell us how you became involved in that.
So in basically what happened was the result of a wedding invitation. And when I left university, I interned at the Financial Times. And one day, the foreign editor was supposed to be going to a lunch of South Asian politicians. And last minute, he couldn't go. So he said to me, "You're always talking about India. Why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went to it and sat next to somebody who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party. And he asked me if I would like to interview Benazir Bhutto, who was then the opposition leader living in exile in London. So of course I said yes. And I went to do this interview. And the day that I did it was the day that she had announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. And we got on very well. And she then went back to Pakistan to try and take on Pakistan's then military dictator, General Zia. And I went, got a job in TV, actually, for Central TV in Birmingham as a trainee reporter. And which I kind of, I used to get what I think is the worst job in journalism, which is we had a lot of people dying in motorway accidents in our area. And so I used to be, because I was young and female, I would be sent to people's houses and asked for a photograph of somebody who died, which is an awful job. And so one day I came home from work and there was this most beautiful gold inscribed invitation on my doormat, and it was to Benazir's wedding in Karachi, which was the most amazing introduction to Pakistan. And course I went. And I'd never been to Pakistan. And her wedding was like something out of the Arabian Nights. It was just so colourful. And also every night after the celebration, there would be discussions with her political colleagues about how to take on and military data. And it was fascinating. I was meeting people who had been tear gassed and arrested to try and bring democracy to a country by so I can really imagine going back to Birmingham and covering local music.
I'm just thinking that just whether in fact we should go back to not having, well, let's keep going, and let's hope the internet connection improves. We can hear much of what you say, Christina, and apologies for the connectivity. In 2000, just rushing forward, we'll come back again. In 2007, you were in the vehicle. I think that was the right year when Benazir, when the bomb went off. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, well, because I had this relationship with Benazir when she went back to Pakistan in 2007 after having been in exile for a long while. She asked me if I would go with her, and so I did. And when we got to Pakistan, she had told me before this she had lots of threats against so actually initially I was going to go with the rest of the media on a different bus, but then when I saw her getting on top and saw all the crowds of people and all the excitement, I really wanted to be there. So I got on top with her, and initially it didn't seem like a problem. There was just so much excitement and people and children and people releasing doves and music, but it was an open top bus and she'd had lots of assassination threats, and Pakistan at that time had more terrorist attacks than anywhere on earth. And we were going under 15 bridges and flyovers, so people could be just standing there. So, but kind of forgot about the threat after a while because the atmosphere was so festive and she was so excited to be back. And it took so long. We were on that bus for 9 hours because it could hardly move because there were so many people. And then eventually, about 11 o'clock at night, and it was dark, suddenly there was this kind of thud, and the bus lurched to a halt and everybody sort of fell to the ground. And it was a small bomb. And then people started getting up. Nobody had been hurt, really. And I covered a lot of suicide bombings, and I know that often there's two blasts. The first blast is just to stop everybody in one place. So I was actually shouting to people not to get up. But before I could really say anything, there was a massive blast. And then everything around us seemed to be on fire. And there was orange flame everywhere. And it was Pakistan's biggest ever bomb. More than 150 people were killed. And we were very lucky to survive.
Was that how did you recover from that kind of hugely traumatic experience, and then with your close friend Benazir Bhutto?
Well, when we then went to her house, and which she hadn't lived in then for 9 years because she'd been in exile, and she went upstairs, and on the stairway there were photographs of her children from when they were young, and as she came back down, she stopped and looked at those photographs, and I knew that she was thinking that she would never see them again. And it was quite clear that whoever had made all that effort to try and kill her that night was not going to stop. So it seemed to me that she was going to be killed, and she was kind of in an impossible situation, because if she had left Pakistan, it would have really looked as though she was running away, and she would have probably been the end of her political career. So she was kind of stuck there, and she was very brave. She was one of the bravest people I've ever met. And for me, that actually year had been a series of things. So I had been in an ambush by the Taliban in Helmand in southern Afghanistan, which narrowly survived. I'd also been in a hotel in Pakistan, which had been suicide bombed, and then this happened. So I did start to feel like my 9 lives were running out. But the night I came back from Pakistan, after that happened, I went to a dinner for a really brave Zimbabwean human rights lawyer, a friend of mine called Beatrice Matetwa, who was beaten by Mugabe and survived many things. And I said to her, I'm wondering about giving this up because it just seems pointless. Not so much the danger, but actually the fact that it didn't make any difference writing about these things, and it didn't change anything. And she said to me, if people like you don't report on what people like me are doing, then what is the point of what we're doing? So I always remembered that afterwards.
Were you then, so you were not surprised when the inevitable fate happened to Benazir?
No, I think that it was clear that they were going to keep trying to do something, but was really shocked when I got the news. It was just after Christmas, and I was actually in Portugal, where my husband's from, and with my parents were visiting, and our son was very small. And we had gone to this kind of Christmas village where people were dressed up as elves and offering cups of cherry brandy. They got injured after a rally in Rawalpindi, and I just knew actually that she died. And then shortly afterwards, we got the news, and it was a really weird situation to be surrounded by all these people dressed as elves and Father Christmases trying to be cheery, and I got this awful news about somebody who I'd known for years and was a friend.
I'm going to go back to 2001 and your bravery and your deportation from Pakistan when you had rumbled the Pakistani intelligence service that had been smuggling arms to the palace to the Taliban. Can you tell us about that, and how worried were you then for your life?
I think that I guess the biggest risks I've had have been in Pakistan. I've had the best experiences in my life and the worst experiences in my life. And Pakistan has this military intelligence agency called ISI, which was behind the distribution of arms to the Afghan fighters, the Afghan Mujahideen, when they were fighting the Russians who'd occupied their country in the late 80s. And lots of money was given by the United States and UK and Saudi Arabia. And it was a covert operation, so it was all channeled through ISI. And they became extremely powerful and have been extremely powerful ever since. And but they also became quite ideological, and they helped create the Taliban. And so after 9/11, when the United States President George W. Bush said to Pakistan, "You're either with us or against us," Pakistan's president, of course, said, "We're with you," because, as he later said in his book, that he said, "I war gamed the United States as an adversary and realized we couldn't take them on." which doesn't exactly sound like the words of a loyal ally. So ISI were told to stop supporting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but it seemed clear to me, I mean, their whole raison d'etre for years had been to help those people, and they had very close relationships with them. And I could not imagine that overnight they were going to actually make this huge change and turn against them. And in fact, they did. And a lot of them were the Taliban. So I wrote about that, and they were very upset.
They were very upset indeed. But they didn't kill you, but they might have killed you.
They came to, I was staying, as were a lot of journalists at the time, in a hotel in Quetta, which is in Pakistan, near the border with Afghanistan, near the border with Canada. And they came, and we were under curfew. So every night we had to be back at 7, and then we couldn't leave until 7 the next morning. And so in the middle of the night, maybe about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got a knock on my bedroom door, and it was a group of men in grey shower kameez and dark glasses that I knew were from ISI. They always dressed like that. And the hotel manager said, these guests have come to see you. And I said, well, it's the middle of the night. Can you tell them to come back tomorrow? And he said, no, it's urgent. And then, of course, he had the key to the door. And so he opened the door, and they broke the chain that I had, and then took my mobile phone, and basically abducted me and took me and held me for a couple of nights.
Tortured you?
They didn't torture me.
Have you been tortured in any form, in interrogation?
I've been interrogated, but not. I've never been physically tortured. No.
When you saw 9/11 happening in Manhattan, did you worry at the time that the West might overplay its hand? And could the West have responded any differently to the way it did?
I don't think they had much choice but to take action. And, we should remember that the action against the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan by the United States then was actually completely supported by the United Nations. It was very different to Iraq a couple of years later. And within Afghanistan, a lot of people welcomed foreign troops coming in because they were fed up with the Taliban and also fed up with warlords before that. And so they thought that this would end the civil war and bring peace. The problem was that Bush was only interested in getting rid of Al-Qaeda and trying to capture bin Laden. He didn't have any interest in what kind of government there was in Afghanistan or really bringing peace and security. He famously said, we're not a police force. And so, not anywhere near enough was done to try and stabilize the country early on. Indeed, only 5,000 troops were in Afghanistan. It's a huge country.
And Osama bin Laden, how come he evaded capture for so long? Did the US tackle that in the right way? And how come you have some of his sweets?
Well, they did have an opportunity early on to capture him when he was in a place called Tora Bora, these White Mountains, where he had all these tunnels and caves. and there was a lot of evidence that he was there. But they didn't have foreign troops in to try and capture him. They contracted it out really to 3 different Afghan warlords who were more interested in taking the money and fighting each other. And he was allowed to escape. I mean, later came out there were actually more journalists at Tora Bora than there were American troops. So he got over the border into Pakistan, and as we know, was then there for 10 years until he was finally found in Abbottabad, in a Pakistani city, living, in a house right in the middle of a military cantonment, right next to the main military school in Pakistan. So it was extremely difficult to believe that Pakistan's military did not know he was there, or at least some element of them, although Pakistan, of course, has always denied that. The reason I have bin Laden sweets is because after 9/11, there was a lot of support in areas of Pakistan for bin Laden because there was a lot of anti-American feeling. So people were selling sweets with his picture on, and I bought some as a sort of weird souvenir and still have them, I'm afraid.
Is the world a better place without him alive?
Yes, I mean, he was determined to kind of wreak destruction on the West and on our way of life, and yeah, so I don't think the problem was that was not the end of Al Qaeda, of course, or of that kind of movement. By killing him, in some ways, you make him a hero, and the ideology lives on. And then, of course, more recently, we've seen ISIS, which in some ways is even more brutal than Al Qaeda.
In what ways? In what ways more brutal, Christina?
Well, some of the things they've done, such as, the beheadings, Al Qaeda had beheaded people, but the scale of it, and things like taking these, there was really horrendous things, and they also boasted a lot about it and made videos of it, and whereas Al Qaeda was more about what they called the sort of spectaculars, so trying to get some really headline grabbing act, whether it was like 9/11 or something else. And I don't think Al Qaeda is gone. I mean, they're still very active in different places.
Malala, tell us about how you met Malala. And there'll be, Christina, some students looking here who might not be familiar with the Malala story.
So Malala was a girl from a place in Swat in northern Pakistan, which got taken over by the Taliban in 2009, and they banned schools, particularly for girls. And she was then a young girl of 12 who was very passionate about school and education, and she couldn't see why she shouldn't be able to go to school. So she wrote a blog anonymously initially for the BBC about it, and she also campaigned, and then the Taliban were pushed out of her area by Pakistan's military, and people came back and schools reopened, but the Taliban had issued a threat against her. And one day she had been doing school exams and she got into the school bus, and as it left not far from the school, it was stopped by a gunman, and he said, "Who is Malala?" And all the girls sort of looked at her, and and she said, "I am Malala," and he shot and in the head. Now she was very lucky because the bullet went just under the eye and didn't go into her brain, but some of the splinters of bone went into her brain, and so she was then flown to Peshawar and operated on, and then she was brought to the UK and treated in Birmingham, and she has really become a worldwide symbol of fighting for children's education. She was the youngest person to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and I was lucky enough to work with her on her book, which we called I Am Malala, and which was great because she is an incredibly inspirational person. I also believe very strongly in the importance of education, and girls' education, and how it can make more difference than anything else. But she was also a lot of fun to work with, and she's a very, very funny girl.
So, Christina, how did you actually write the book with her? How does that work? And it's sold a million copies, and it's translated all around the world, and yeah.
So I stayed at her house. So then she'd just come out of hospital, and her parents had also come over from Pakistan, and her two brothers. And so I would stay with them and basically get them to talk about their life in Pakistan. And she basically, apart from her own story, she had grown up in a very interesting time in Pakistan because she'd been born just a few years before 9/11, and that time saw a great kind of transformation in Pakistan, a lot of radicalization, a lot of people in the area that she lived, which was very poor. Lots of young men went to go and fight and join the Taliban. So it was also a really good way of telling that story through her and what she'd gone through. And so we had a lot of fun working on the book. Sometimes it was difficult because her family are very sociable, and so people were always turning up, was trying to get them talking about things that happened because we didn't have very much time to write the book.
Another extraordinary story was 2 years later, in 2015, Eugene, the story about the incredible journey from Syria in a wheelchair. Tell us about that.
So I think, to me, one of the great privileges of my job, although I go to bad places, I meet some really amazing people in those places. And Eugene is one of the most remarkable people that I have ever met. And I met her in the midst of the refugee crisis in 2015, when lots of people came into Europe from Syria, from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and there was sort of, big outcry, how are we going to cope with all these people? And I always felt that if you met just one of them and listened to their story, you would not be able to turn them away. It was when they became this big number that people were and spoke about them almost as if they were a plague, or they used expressions like that. And so to me, the refugee crisis, we basically saw the best and worst of humanity. And the worst was the governments that tried to stop people coming in. And the best were local people who came, in my view, was who built a 12-foot high wall to stop people. And the day that they finished that, I was on the Hungarian side with a group of journalists, and somebody said, the Serbian side, 16-year-old girl from Syria, from Aleppo, in a wheelchair, who speaks fluent English and wants to be an astronaut. And that's like journalistic gold. So of course I wanted to find her, and I did. And it was true. She did speak fluent English, and not only that, but she had learned it from, and she'd watched it in Aleppo when she was growing up. Because she couldn't walk, she had cerebral palsy. She had basically almost never left her apartment, which was on the 5th floor. She had never gone to school, and she'd learned everything she knew from watching television. And actually, she really knew a lot. She knew all about string theory. She watched lots of the history channels, so she could list all the British kings and queens, which I couldn't do. And very funny. And in fact, when I said to her, "What do you think of Europe?" at the beginning, she said, "Oh, I'm disappointed." So I said, "Why are you disappointed?" And she said, "Well, it's the food." And she said, "I watched MasterChef all the time at home, and I thought the food would look like that."
So we're I mean, I would absolutely recommend everyone listening here to buy the books that Christina has written. And then on to Our Bodies, an article that you wrote 2 weeks ago in the Sunday Times, by the way, was described in the letters page as the finest article this person had read in any newspaper in 40 years. This incredibly powerful and moving story, book. Can you tell us how you came to write it and what you were trying to do in that, Christina?
So when I started out as a correspondent covering mostly war and conflict, there were very few other women doing, and I was always much more interested in what happened to the women in the war. It seemed to me that most of the reporting was about the men because they were doing the fighting, but the people who were actually keeping all the families together and feeding and protecting and sheltering them, educated in telling that. But there is a very dark story too about women in war, which is brutality against women and sexual violence in particular. And in the last few years, I've seen more violence against women than in any time in my whole 30-odd years of reporting. And I was very shocked by this. I couldn't understand why should it be getting worse. And so it was things like the Yazidis taken by ISIS and sold on and on. Sometimes, you know, I met girls who were sold 12 times as if they were a goat or something. And then in Nigeria, girls captured by Boko Haram and taken to be their bushwives in the forest and forcibly married and raped. And then also the Rohingyas who fled from the Burmese military into Bangladesh. And the women I met there all had stories about being tied to banana trees by Burmese military and gang rape and just horrific stories. So I couldn't understand why this was going on. And we were all reporting it, and yet nothing was happening to change it. So I started to really become a bit obsessed about it and look at why wasn't any just open and writing a book about
We're just having slight problems hearing you again, Christina, but do keep talking and about how you hope the book might change reality and whether war makes beasts of men. Does that have to happen? Does that happen if the armies are not properly disciplined?
It's difficult to know. I mean, when you work on a book like that, and you see women will be abducted, so it's not something new, but that doesn't mean that it's something we shouldn't do something about. And so that's why I decided to try and write about it. I'm just going to move, because it's better. Sorry.
Thank you, everybody, for your patience. We've heard 90% and 95%, Christina.
Okay.
It's a lot worse, a lot better than we feared at the beginning. Okay, we can see you very clearly there.
Okay, let's hope this is better. You've lost the Bin Laden sweets in the background.
But we've gained 5 books on the staircase, which we will never know what they are. So you're telling us about the impact of the book, and also how harrowing that was for you to write. And could a man have written the book?
Well, I think it would have been very difficult for because the hardest thing is getting the women to speak to you. These are really difficult stories to tell, you know, the most personal and awful ordeals that they've been through. So I think it was easier for them to talk to a woman than a man about it.
We could hear you there, and just bringing it together. And I'm just going to ask people here to start sending it in questions. So Christina, bringing all this together, and I would again very strongly recommend everyone to buy that book. Where does your life go now? You've taken extraordinary risks. You've brought truth, dark truth, sometimes, often maybe, to people on their in their homes in the West and throughout the world. Have you done enough? Do you want to keep going with this?
Well, of course, this is a very odd time to be a foreign correspondent, because we can't travel at the moment because of coronavirus. So actually, for the first time pretty much in my career, I've been reporting on my own country and my own city, London. This story enacts me that we've slightly forgotten the rest of the world, and because we're so concerned at what's happening to ourselves, and in fact, you know, wars have not stopped in other places, things are still going on, and other countries are much less able to deal with coronavirus than us. But you know, at the moment, I've really been reporting from here, and hopefully things will change and I will be able to travel in future. But you know, like everybody, life's a bit in a strange we're all kind of adapting, doing things like virtual events instead of sitting actually next to you by the fireside.
And on to questions. Maria asks you, Christina, how hard is it seeing all the things that you have, dealing with the emotional side that comes with that? Have you had good support when you've come back from the field and needed it?
I think there's much more awareness now about that than when anywhere. In fact, I had a colleague who was off for almost a year with PTSD, and we were not allowed to tell anybody where she was. We had to pretend she was on holiday. This is including to other colleagues on the newspaper. So that's changed. But to be completely honest, the thing I find absolutely hardest to deal with is not so much the awful things that you stories that you hear. I guess all foreign correspondents, hope that if you expose injustices and terrible things, that people will do something about it. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen always. And so when you keep going back to a place and you write about things and you pour your heart out to try and change things, and people have entrusted you with their stories and sometimes made a lot of risks to talk to you, and then nothing changes, that's very hard to deal with. That's the hardest thing.
It must be. And then Marie Colvin's death in February 2012, was that very difficult? Did that bring things home to you at all?
I'm sorry, I missed the
Marie Colvin's death in February 2012. Did that bring things home to you, Christina?
Absolutely.
And again, for the students' benefit, can you just refresh memories about her?
Yeah, so Marie Colvin was actually an American journalist, but she'd worked most of her career for British newspapers, and she worked for my paper, the Sunday Times, actually long before I joined. So she was one of my heroines. I wanted to work there because she worked there. And she was very brave. She always sort of stayed in places longer than anyone else, and took huge risks. And she was in Syria when it became extremely dangerous for journalists to be in places that were being bombed by Assad forces. And there was a particular place called Hotwood, and of course that really brought home, she was my colleague, she was my friend, really brought home the dangers. And of course you feel like, is it worth it? And in my case, I have family, I have a child, and so I think I don't take the kind of risks that she was taking. But it's a bit difficult to know, because to be completely honest, the times that I've been in most danger were often things that weren't supposed to be dangerous, and then something happened. So you can't always predict.
And a question here about does having a family change your attitude to the risks that you're taking?
I think the job has become much more risky than it used to be. I mean, when I started out, if anything happened to you, it was much more a bad luck, or or you'd done something stupid. Now we are targets in a way that we didn't used to be. Particularly like terrorist groups want to kill journalists because that gives them headlines.
Susan asks, given the recognition of rape as a war crime in the Rwanda and Bosnia war crime cases in the ICC today, are we better able to deal with violence against women? So you've slightly answered that. Has that improved the lot of women?
Well, one of my great frustrations with this is, rape is a war crime. We know that. We know these stories. For example, the Yazidi women, bravely came forward and told what had happened to them, and how ISIS had taken them and done such terrible things. So no one can say they didn't know. And yet there still haven't been any prosecutions. And this is a big problem. It is really difficult to get justice. Of course, it's difficult to get justice for rape anywhere, even, you know, this country, we saw the lowest level of conviction where maybe the people are actually carrying out attacks from the police or from the military, then it's so difficult. And those people really need help from us.
And the question of the Rohingya and Aung San Suu Kyi, was that disillusion? Did you pin yourself high hopes on Aung San Suu Kyi? As did Gordon Brown and many people.
Yeah, I think, well, like many people, you know, she seemed like a beacon of human rights, you know, bravery. She'd risked so much. She spent so many years under house arrest, and she wore these flowers in her hair, and she was separated from her husband and children and couldn't see her husband even when he was dying. So she'd given up so much, and yet she has done nothing for the Rohingya. Not only that, but in December, I was at The Hague when the case was brought against the government of Burma or Myanmar for what they've done to the Rohingya and accused of genocide. And she personally went there and led the defense and to justify what had happened. And she stood there almost, you know, impassive for 3 days as the most unbelievable stories were told of, particularly of the violence against women.
What happened to her? Was there always a weakness in her character?
I don't know whether she was never what we thought she was, that we kind of built something that we hoped, or whether, you know, some people say, well, I think you lost me briefly.
Keep going.
Some people say that, you know, maybe she doesn't really have power, that it's the army that control things, and that so she's just doing what she can. But I mean, for her to have chosen to actually go to The Hague and defend what they were doing internationally, that's really taking a position. That's not just standing. So yeah, I think that we're all very disappointed in her, basically.
And Adam says, do you ever go back and keep in touch to see how the people you've helped are faring?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm lucky in that I have been able to go back and forth to the same places. So, like, my biggest passion is Afghanistan, which I first went to as a young journalist and have gone back and forth ever since. So, I have many friends there and I keep in touch. Same with Pakistan and some of the other countries where I've lived. I've lived in Brazil too, and South Africa. And these days, I mean, I talked about how the job had changed in terms of becoming more dangerous, but the good way it's changed is it's become a lot easier to do communication. When I started out, if you can imagine students that are watching, there were no mobile phones, there was no internet. If I wanted to keep in touch with people, I had to write letters to them or phone them on old-fashioned phone lines, and often these countries, you know, people didn't have phones or it was impossible to get through. So then it was really difficult to keep in touch. Now almost everyone I meet is on WhatsApp or Telegram, or, you know, so I keep in touch with everybody. And sometimes that's hard, as I said, because they then ask you, you know, I told you, I gave you this interview, and what difference did it make?
Difficult. Tom asks how your experiences, Christina, have changed you, and have they given you a different outlook on your life?
I think it's made me, I mean, actually the hardest thing actually about the job. It's not so much being in dangerous or difficult places, it's coming back. And sometimes it's very difficult to have patience with people when they talk about being annoyed by something someone said, or by missing a train, or some small thing. And you think, well, I just come from somewhere where people are risking their life to go to work every day, or or to just go and buy food. And so I think it's made me, but it's also made me much more, um, sounds odd, but more hopeful about humanity, because I go to bad places and yet I see people doing really amazing things. And I think we've kind of seen that now in the coronavirus time, that, our lives changed overnight in a way we couldn't imagine. And yet, we've seen people doing remarkable things, and a lot of kind of people helping each other. I know my neighbours much more than I ever did, even though, we couldn't actually meet, but we were all exchanging messages, waving and seeing. And I hope we don't lose that at the end.
And the final question is from Jane. What's been the best and the worst thing about your job?
Wow, that's difficult. I mean, the best really is working with people like Malala and Najeen, these amazing people, and hopefully, helping further their campaigns with Najeen about disabled refugees, and with Malala on education. And also, I don't want it to sound like it's all hard work. You have a lot of fun getting to these places, and you meet amazing people, and it's a privilege to be in places where you're watching the news sort of happen. The hardest thing, well, I spend a lot of time in airports waiting for planes that never come. And yeah, that's sort of the frustration of it, the bureaucracy in some countries, the travel. I mean, since 9/11, the security made it much slower. I'm afraid now with coronavirus, traveling also is going to be much more complicated than it used to be.
And would your headmistress at Nonsuch, who had such a dim view of your theatrical traits, have been pleased with you, do you think, if she was to meet you now, Christina? Would you say you'd had a good life?
Well, I feel like I've had a very, I mean, I can honestly say I have never been bored in my job. I can say that. So, and so I feel very like being, and now the journalist.
I think we'll end it. I think that thank you, Christina, very, very much indeed. It's the bad connection is we haven't got a good connection here is one of the most frequent sayings of the whole coronavirus, along with I think you're on mute, which probably is the number one statement that we've all come across. It was, and we're going to pick up some of the themes there that Christina was talking about when on Tuesday we have Terry Waite, who was in solitary confinement for 5 years in Lebanon in the 1980s. And then on Friday, we've got the writer, children's and writer Michael, an adult writer, Michael Morpurgo, talking. But Christina, that was absolutely wonderful. And as the Vice Chancellor of this university, I can think of no finer a role model, possibly for our students and staff and community, than you and your life and the way that you've lived it, and the humility that you show, and the optimism that you have for life. And thank you so very very much. And
thank you so
thank
much.
you.
And I'm so sorry about the internet. I wish I had the excuse of saying, oh, I was in some remote part of Afghanistan, but I'm in London.
We heard you perfectly there, and thank you. Thank you, everybody.